Test. Okay. We're going to have our first keynote at this year's Bornhack 2019. It's a well-known guest. We've had her before here. It's Amelia Annarsdottir, who's going to give the talk. We're in the long haul reflections on European internet policies in 2019. Give a big round of applause to Amelia.
Yeah, so greetings and salutations. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you for being so many people in the audience tonight. My name is Amelia Annarsdottir, and for the past 13 years, I've been working on digital rights in various capacities. I started out caring about copyright and surveillance issues, heated debates in the Swedish society, some of which will be remembered by people who were old enough in 2005 to 2009, all the way back in 2006. I also served as a member of the European Parliament on behalf of the Swedish Pirate Party between 2011 and 2014. Since 2015, I run a Swedish NGO called Dataskydd.net that tries to assist the government with the implementation of the European legislation, General Data Protection Regulation, in Sweden locally. And for the past couple of years, I have had the big fortune of working with UK-based non-governmental organization Article 19 and their program to assess the impact of technical design choices in technical standards organizations and how to enable individuals to use their connected technologies to exercise their human rights. To disclose some more on my background, in just in case anyone is interested, I have a bachelor in mathematics, and I also wrote a bachelor thesis on business law, oriented towards competition and antitrust in the telecommunications sector, more specifically net neutrality. I'm enrolled in a master's course at Uppsala University that is slowly progressing since 2017, and it's going somewhere, yeah. This speech was originally proposed for an event in Norway that never happened. But I was asked earlier this year to share some of my thoughts on the state of information policy today, so I've tried to recycle it for your benefit here, and I hope that it will be relevant. So information policy is a very broad field. It encompasses many things, from innovation policy to human rights and democracy, also public sector technologies. But I will try to narrow it down to some examples that I believe contextualize really important issues for our contemporary European societies today. I also want to quickly make the caveat that I am not an expert on domestic Danish issues. So I will not have so many local relevant examples from here. Also, most of my contemporary examples will somehow naturally come from Swedish law, because this is where I've been operating for the past couple of years. So therefore, should you find me Sweden or EU-centric, those are the reasons. It's simply from where I am and where I'm based. I should also clarify that I am speaking on behalf of myself today and not on behalf of any of the organizations for which I'm currently working. These are just some of the accumulated reasonings that I make based on my experience over the past decade or so. I was also planning to cover 3 different topics. I have no slides because I hoped that I could get away with not doing them. I will cover 3 separate topics today that for some of you will feel like they're quite old, but I will justify this perspective. So firstly, I want to cover national security and its relation to the internet in broad terms. Secondly, I want to cover public institutions and their struggle with bestness and computers and connections, and the way in which this almost religious approach to computers and efficiencies is not actually very useful. Lastly, I want to return to a topic that some of you may have followed in the spring, which is copyright. It's an issue I believe continues to be relevant for internet discussions, and that has a big impact on how our technologies are shaped. So in information policy, of course, new topics also crop up by the day. We have new surveillance laws, new interesting means for law enforcement or companies to encroach on individual freedoms and rights. We have new corporate rights aiming to foreclose competition or restrict individuals, and so forth. We are living in a time where governments and companies are becoming increasingly more powerful, while individuals are becoming increasingly less powerful. For a short while around the Snowden revelations, there were discussions around this, like serious global discussions. I find the reflection of Barton Gellman, an American journalist who covered the Snowden leaks, particularly fitting. It is as if we are behind a one-way mirror, where we, as citizens and consumers, are increasingly more transparent to companies who are increasingly more opaque to us. Good news are few, they're far between, and to add insult to injury, governments all over the world are now also beating the cyber war drums. Your router, which just yesterday was a consumer security disaster by virtue of the poor procurement practices of telecommunications operators and the lack of oversight, is now a war zone, effectively limiting the government's sense of urgency in applying even the few norms that were already in place. This is a real issue. Meanwhile, human rights courts are increasingly bogging themselves down in state perspectives rather than individual perspectives. At the end of the day, as a society, we have not advanced very far beyond the Westphalian model. The European Union, which started out as a brilliant postmodernist experience of having states compromise and negotiate rather than colonially pushing their views on one another in a contest for power, is also increasingly modernist. We see it not in the least in the adoption of a stale French proposal to promote European prominence by introducing heavy regulatory requirements on US web services in copyright law, in contradiction with what most successful web businesses, few of which, by the way, are French, would argue Europe needs. These are long-term trends. The remodernization of state-to-state relations and state-to-citizen relations, the return to a worldview where loyalty to king and country goes first, and loyalty with the individual citizen or the private businesses always comes second. And on the internet, the disastrous consequence that using the internet as a battlefield implies that each of us, however unknowingly, are caught in the crossfire anytime we strike our keyboards. The European Union faces some interesting challenges in this respect. In the past 4 years alone, the European Union has produced not one, but 2 new laws aiming at harmonizing network and information security rules around the EU. The reason for this is, of course, that most information and communication technologies are developed by and distributed by private sector companies to consumers who are either individuals, public sector institutions, or other private sector companies. Think about a Wi-Fi access point set up at the kindergarten or a printer installed at some local office, for instance. For most of these producers and consumers of information and communication technologies, being in a war zone is inconvenient. It limits their choices, makes the products available more expensive, and it risks reducing the quality of service by adding restrictions imposed from national requirements. The European Union is trying to fix this problem by ensuring that any security-motivated nationalist and protectionist measures are at least harmonious in the European trade area. But EU member states, in general, are not stupid, and they recognize when somebody is trying to integrate competencies that they consider core to their identities in a global world just into a market space. So the first European attempt at harmonization of this very important field of network and information security was the NIS Directive of 2015. Some of you may even be professionally involved in implementing it. It was watered down to the point of being basically useless. The only hard requirement in the European text is for breach notifications to go to some public authority and land in an archive. It's the third European act at that which requires some form of breach notifications, the others being the e-Privacy Directive of 2009 and the General Data Protection Regulation of 2016. And only the e-Privacy Directive of 2009 recognizes that breach notifications that tell about when a company has screwed up with customer data may be of interest to the customer. All the other laws at the European level put first and foremost the interest of public authorities to gather large amounts of breach notifications, presumably in some archive. I was recently alerted to how the implementation of the Network and Information Security Directive in Sweden was extremely poor. Almost 2 years after the entry into effect of the Swedish implementation of the NIS Directive, many organizations still don't know if they're covered. or if they need to care about this legislation. I feel vindicated by this knowledge because already in 2015 it was obvious that the Swedish government had speedily acted to produce its own local NIS law to compete with the European framework. The Swedish homebrew legislation takes a national security perspective, which is not at all adapted for market norms and does not take into consider consumers or individuals at all. And it doesn't concern, and it's also not in the nature of a government security apparatus to take those considerations. I had predicted that these frameworks would compete and that market actors, if they were wise, would recognize that the nationalist air of national security laws is much stronger than the consumer-oriented approach of the European Union, and that therefore, by doing risk management, you would choose to follow the national security legislation, so the local homebrew one. The European Commission, in addition, must have felt immediately that the NIS directive wasn't going to work, because they acted even in 2016 to create a cybersecurity regulation, which, by virtue of being a regulation, becomes immediately applicable in all the member states. So no sooner than everyone had put their pens down, there was a directive in place, member states had implemented it, the European Parliament and the member states were already back into negotiations about yet another law. And now the European Union has a system for adopting cybersecurity standards. But my point is, I guess, that the speed at which these new initiatives are launched and the speed at which we're passing new laws at the scale of the European Union is in itself an indication of the failure of the cybersecurity state in Europe. The fact of the matter is that member states in general are not willing to give up national security competencies, and this is harming the inner market, and the European Union is not being able to do much about it. It is still expected of all of us that we accept that we are treated worse by our governments and worse by our companies and service providers because we are expected to have this grand idea of loyalty with the antiquated idea of a modernist state imposing itself on us and on our neighbors. I find this field so fascinating because it's really, we're kind of in a breaking point of history. It feels like to me as if we're at this cusp where we can choose to be lulled back into the 19th century and nation-state competition, or whether we advance into the 21st century and we just recognize that we can make good, productive economic legislation that helps everyone. For Europeans now, more than at any time, we can actually choose. Well, I mean, within some limits because we are constrained by the particularly strong modernist traditions in some EU member states. But we can choose, at least in theory, whether we believe that the world is a competition between civilizations or whether the world itself is, in fact, a civilization. Let me contextualize this with an example that may seem trivial, but I also find it very encouraging and a bit cute. So 2 years ago, I was working over summer as an opinion editorial writer at the local paper in the mid-north of Sweden. I came across the Swedish village of Grövelsjön to the west of Älvdalen municipality, bordering Norway, and the equally delightful village of Grövelsjön, which I had the great pleasure of visiting. It's on the Norwegian side of the border, they just have the same name. Älvdalen, for context, is one of the most sparsely populated municipalities of Sweden. It's the 15th largest municipality, has only 7,000 inhabitants. So this is like really rural, and it's also really far, like northwest. It's, you can go skiing there in the winter. But surprisingly, these areas around Älvdalen and other locations in that municipality, like Särna or Idre, which if you're skiers, you might recognize these names, they are exceptionally well connected. The burning light of one man, former telecoms equipment developer Agne Fredriksson, ensured around 2010 that all the villages of the Swedish side of the border of Grövelsjön would make use of European funds to roll out fiber optic cable village networks. Now in Grövelsjön and Sorkmyren, the lights are on and the connections are 100 megabits symmetric. I visited this place, and I must say there is something very special about being in a place so remote that you have no connection on your 3G, but the Wi-Fi password the guest Wi-Fi password gives you immediate access to high-speed, high-quality connectivity. The village networks of Älvdalen municipality, and there are 15 of them, in turn created the opportunity for the municipal broadband coordinator to focus on backhaul. In many municipalities of Sweden, you see, fiber optic rollout has been achieved with city networks. The most prominent example of which is Stokab, that operate both the backhaul and the last mile. But Älvdalen is extremely geographically large, it's a vast place. So having all of the villages make their own investments in their own local infrastructures allowed the municipalities, so the public institutions, to connect the villages. They're now the only municipality in their region that is set to cover the 95% broadband coverage targets that has been set for 2020. It's a really fantastic, inspiring place. But one of the issues for this region on infrastructure rollout, let's say, is that it's very mountainous. So building backhaul is not only expensive because of the nature of building backhaul, it's also expensive because the landscape doesn't lend itself well to infrastructure deployment. I was informed that one of the ways in which the Swedish village of Gravelsjön could have cheaply solved their interconnection with the rest of the municipality was by taking a wire into the Norwegian Gravelsjön for about 2 kilometers. But that wasn't possible because there's a border between countries. So they had to instead dig the cable around 20 kilometers around the mountain to get back to the main backhaul network. So in Norway, apparently it is the case that they have these regions and then they allocate them to operators to build infrastructure on. So it's difficult to reconcile the Swedish model of village networks with the Norwegian model of regional monopolies. Also in Gravelsjön, Norway, the local provider was a copper-based ADSL network, so they had no interest in fiber. But additionally, in Sweden, we have a mass surveillance law which dictates that all traffic crossing the border needs to be interceptable by our civilian intelligence agency. So building the backhaul into Norway, even though it had been very cheap and convenient for the municipality, actually presents a problem for both the national security establishment and for the municipality. How do you solve this problem? The solution was to make the least efficient choice. They built the very long cable. The municipality had to spend a lot of money. And now the citizens of Gravelsjön, Norway, are still stuck at ADSL networks, whereas the Swedish Gravelsjön is connected. So that's, you can't win all the battles. But it is but one of many sad examples of how old nationalist, protectionist policies stop active, community-minded Scandinavians from cooperating for a better future. I recognize that the gist of the story is that things on the Swedish side of the border worked out fine. But I cannot be satisfied that our Norwegian friends continue to suffer under low-quality internet connections when the most easy and logical choice would have been for them not to do so. These issues, infrastructure policy and national security, they're age-old. They seem boring, but they have a big impact on our societies. So when I was asked to make a statement on what issues I believe will be important going forward, they are such issues. The avalanche of many new and bad ideas must not cause us to lose sight of the many old problems that are still around, and I think that we can also work together to solve them. I'm not necessarily a believer even in trend-setting policies, but I do believe that politics should solve outstanding issues. And I can add to this a different outstanding issue, it's my second topic, that is somehow not only related to the internet and the World Wide Web, but to the very nature of computation itself. So for years now, artificial intelligence and machine learning have been trending topics in global debates on privacy, autonomy, and indeed as well national security. These discussions started around the same time that I was working a lot on the Swedish implementation of the data protection regulation. And therefore, I had fresh in my mind all of the government investigations that were made in the 1960s and 1970s around computerizations in Scandinavia and Europe at large. And it is really surprising how computing can be such a slowly advancing discussion, because really, politically speaking, one could argue that we are still stuck in the same place that we were 50 years ago. For one, any new information and communication technology brings with it the hope of more precision, more efficiency and greater precision. It is envisaged that we as a society will become better, faster, stronger, from the deployment of many, many machines. In fact, one could argue society, not just Scandinavia, but globally, has the naive impression that machines can save us from ourselves. After seeing discussions on machines as from decision makers over half a century, I am no longer optimistic about this perspective. The internet is great, it's true, but it is great precisely because we all get to know one another, hang out, chat, exchange culture or texts or banter, but computers in general do not remove from societies any of the inherent issues that arise from human-to-human interactions. Let me contextualize with two examples from the public authorities of the state which issues my passports, or back in my crib. Firstly, when Sweden computerized its public and private sector in the 1960s, big benefits were expected for everyone. Sweden would be efficient and at the forefront and have national companies leading the global revolution. But in the 1970s, many of the big benefits envisaged of centralized computing had failed to materialize. Not only were things not very much more efficient, but it also turned out that the new centralized computer systems introduced a large range of maintenance problems, which served to shift demand for labor to other parts of the organizations, but worse, for the government at least, unlike for railroads and telephony, the government also frequently had to rely on private companies to acquire the right expertise. The government, puzzled by this circumstance, observed that people had failed to adapt themselves to the machines, and that further benefits would surely arise down the line. By the end of the 1970s, it was of course becoming obvious that machines in themselves were not infallible. They could have bugs, malfunction, and when they were connected to each other, there could be other, even deliberate security issues like hacking. By the 80s, the government realized that dealing with all of these issues that come from computer systems costs a lot of money. While there can be no particular political responsibility attributed to what happened next, it is true that Swedish public institutions in that time developed business models to cover the costs of computers that today make them a slightly more sinister version of Google. Most large Swedish public databases are, in fact, by law, constituted, erected, set up, maintained to provide careful profiles of citizens to advertisers. This is true for the tax database, it's true for the traffic registry, it's true for the general population database, and also for the corporate registry. Because by law, citizens cannot, as they do on web services, spoof information, so hide their information or obfuscate their data behind junk information. These government profiling activities are not, as in the case of web services, machine learning based. There is no need for the government to resort to statistical models to explain the properties of individual members of the Swedish public, because they have enough data to be deterministic. So I would be the first person to concede that the 90s and the early 2000s weren't actually that bad though. Broadband rollout, the personal computer reform, peer-to-peer networks, all of this worked out. The tax authority was also reformed in a way in Sweden that enabled them to make good use of computers. For the vast majority of my life, declaring taxes in Sweden has, for most people, been as simple as sending a text message. Those types of reforms, of course, they're helpful, and they inspire confidence that computers sometimes lead to good things. And you will forgive me, I hope, for not delaying too much on these hopeful topics at this time, but I will come back to them at some point later. Unfortunately, though, all of the good aspects of internet and connectivity have not really been embraced by our public sectors at large. By 2010, for instance, the Swedish government had relabeled computerization as digitalization and appeared to go straight back to the 1960s. Again, there were predictions of Swedish bestness, poorly defined, and ever in the future, Sweden will be the best at digitalization. There's no particular concretization of what this is. Narratives emerged where it was not the case that the internet connected people and enabled friendships and cultural exchange or world peace, but where, in fact, the internet was a cesspit of low morality and where individuals attacked other individuals, but somehow the government would make this into a more efficient public sector. It was also no longer the case that the state, through thoughtful use of information and communication technologies, could serve its people. It was the case that individual members of the public were harming individuals of the public, and that the state's primary role and responsibility was punishing individuals who were internet users. This is for a large part the same discussion that was had in the 1970s. That there's these vain aspirations that computers will save the public sector from some built-in inefficiencies. And there's also a feeling that if only people could adapt themselves and all of their social interactions to the machines, it will be okay. There's never anything wrong with the machines, there's only ever something wrong with the people. I say, and perhaps with blissful nostalgia of the 1970s and the early 2000s, that we should not ask what we can do for our governments when it comes to computers. We should ask what our computers can do for us. And it's true that we should expect more from our governments than for them to pit us against one another. It's not useful. So secondly, let me touch a bit on law enforcement issues, and in particular those demands for new law enforcement competencies that require intrusive unmonitored surveillance, such as data retention, data requests, or hacking. In this perspective, I might be a bit Sweden-centric. All of the EU member states have their own legal traditions and histories, so I apologize for this in advance. It's my own confinement to the Westphalian state, if you so will. It's been frequently raised, especially by those that fear the internet and computers, that these platforms are a bit like the Wild Wild West and that they must be regulated. I have increasingly come to share this view, but not from the perspective from which it is normally raised, but rather from the perspective of the impunity with which our government authorities act on these platforms. Data retention is an age-old debate that rose to prominence again as the European Court of Justice, the EU's highest court, declared it disproportional and unnecessary in December of 2016, favoring instead measures targeted at specific individuals who are specifically suspected of a crime. It's not new on the agenda. There are Swedish police officers who have been working since I was in 3rd grade of elementary school on creating global conditions for data retention. While I cherish the 1990s and the early 2000s, I also acknowledge that in the background there were dark forces at play. And it's been litigated, data retention, many times. As many as 9 European constitutional courts have declared data retention illegal before Sweden had its Data Retention Act passed in 2012. You would think that in such a challenged situation, and with such little evidence to back up the efficiency of data retention, the Swedish law enforcement, having nagged for 20 years to get that tool, would have ensured that they got the statistical evidence on the usefulness of having data retention as a working tool. But you would think wrongly. In fact, law enforcement efficiency in Sweden has been on the decline for a couple of decades, and is frequently and aggressively raised in the media. The drop in efficiency increased after 2012 when data retention was passed. And the national-wide reorganization of the Swedish police in 2015, I am told, caused them to not have any data, unfortunately, on data retention at all. So they don't know if this helped them. They feel it did, perhaps, but we can't prove it. Mysteriously, Sweden appears not to be alone in the European Union on having this problem. Data retention is allegedly the silver bullet that will stop society's decay, and yet it is impossible to demonstrate exactly how it does so. If one is being religious about data collection and believe that computers will bring bestness, efficiency, and save us from ourselves, then of course that belief might be sufficient to sustain the optimistic view that the lack of results today may not persist into the future. But I believe that in the data retention discussions, more than in any other society debate on surveillance, we can see the flaws of this religion. For one, Sweden is a fairly well-regulated society and assesses the efficiency of its public institutions a lot, to the point of inefficiency, even, some would say. In the case of law enforcement, we have direct evidence that police officers in Sweden are bad at handling evidence, suffer from inferior internal organization planning systems, and are additionally unskilled at investigating crime scenes. As far as I can determine, they are not trained in interrogation techniques, and they're not offered even to be trained in interrogation techniques. But religion is not rational, and the public institution in charge of evaluating police activities has increasingly come to be seen as a conspiracy monger, devalued and insulted for covering up facts, and it's generally portrayed as incompetent. So in spite of them demonstrating real problems in the police force in Sweden for years, and in spite of arguing that the police is not challenged by their lack of data, but by having too much, data retention is still seen as the silver bullet, which will save us from ourselves. And all of these weird conspiracy theories, they're not even raised by weird people on Twitter, but by reasonable members of the public, or even of government ministers. In law enforcement activities on the internet and around computers, we are increasingly living in a religious society that puts beliefs above facts, and that addresses facts by throwing mud at the institutions in charge of it. This is at best silly. At worst, it causes the Swedish Minister of Interior Affairs to unrighteously threaten Swedish telecommunications operators with fines and withdrawn licenses, because he is unwilling to take responsibility for real problems in the Swedish police force, real problems for police officers and the public when real crimes are committed. If one is religious around data collection and believes that eventually, surely, it must save us from ourselves, this insistence on overlooking the evidence and turning a blind eye to real human rights concerns caused by these religious methods can be justified on faith alone. So a challenge then for individuals who seek to engage in these information policy debate is how to counter this religion. Well, the internet is great, and that's true, but it's precisely because we all get to know one another and hang out and chat and exchange culture. Computers in general, or data, do not remove from society the issues that arise from human interactions. And it brings to my promised finale, actually, which addresses a topic that continues to be of great concern and which influences internet users around the world every day in a restrictive way that also, for the European Union, brings the particular challenge of creating community and camaraderie. I'm talking, of course, about copyright and the botched reform that the European communities recently passed. So to bring some perspective to this issue, let me point out that I can physically move my body from Malmö to Köpenhamn in about 30 minutes by train at no great cost or effort to myself. I basically just get a ticket and sit, and suddenly I'm across the border. Going the other way has been made more difficult by border controls enacted by the stressed out government in Stockholm, that unfortunately feels the economic development and fortitude of the southern parts of their territory is not useful. But I would still argue it's not more difficult than, say, a 40 or 50-minute train ride with a brief stop at Copenhagen Airport. It's a leg stretcher. Let's call it a public health initiative. If I were to attempt moving an MP3 file containing music across the same border, I would be easily stuck in license negotiations for 2 years before it succeeded. And if I were anything other than a big commercial entity, it would be seriously challenging for me even to get the right legal expertise. If it's an MP4 file containing not only audio but also video, I will argue that I have next to no chance of transferring the file legally without institutional backing. This is, of course, really ridiculous. We allegedly have free movement of people in the European Union, but we cannot move the things that connect people. Culture, experiences, shared happiness, references across the same borders. For the longest of time, sharing cultural experiences with Germans has been a massive pain because every time I try, I get the response that they find the video is not available in their country. The European Union has been trying to address some of these issues, well, about 4 times actually in the past 4 years, always failed. They always hit the wall. They tried to get rid of geo-blocking, but then somebody inserted an exception for audiovisual content. So the very thing that caused geo-blocking to be an issue is still an issue. But at least now I can order stuff from Amazon.de, which of course I never do because I don't speak German. And also most people of the European Union actually had no pressing need to order stuff from Amazon.de. They just wanted to share YouTube videos of Schnappi, das kleine Krokodil. They tried to make special rules for cultural heritage, but they end up imposing on librarians due diligence. I ended up being able to access the train schedule from Luxembourg to Brussels for 1862, which, again, I mean, it was great, but only for about 2 seconds. And if we're honest, knowing when people could depart from Luxembourg to Brussels in 1862 may be of academic interest to a small range of individuals studying the history of trains or public transport. But it doesn't really cut it if what we're trying to do is build real relationships between broad groups of Scandinavians and Luxembourgians and Belgians in the 2010s or the 2020s. Just doesn't cut it. A fairly well-known Swedish company, I go again back to my native country, Spotify, exemplifies the failures of the European markets as much as it exemplifies how easily accessible streaming services could have been a good market opportunity for creative industries going forward. Their launch pattern was Sweden, Netherlands, UK, and the US. Only after establishing themselves on the US market were they able to come back to the EU to establish themselves in other jurisdictions here, such as Germany or France. Meanwhile, many Europeans, especially the more tech-savvy ones, had been using Spotify by proxies, essentially cheating the service by claiming that they were listening from a jurisdiction in which they were not based. And doing so to Spotify's detriment at that, since Spotify's licensing requirements would actually not have covered such consumption. But it is surely a failure of the European inner market that new services cannot approach it without first establishing a strong presence in the US market. It gives a big advantage to US companies who, of course, by default, establish themselves in the US before they go to Europe. An EU company has twice the work and must be twice as good to have half a chance of becoming an EU company at all, as does a US company. These are real economic problems that the European Union should really want to solve. Some video streaming services have become popular across the European economic area as well, but they are US video streaming services by the logic I just presented. The response of the EU was to force these services to have a certain percentage of locally produced content, because it does not register with the vast majority of politicians in the EU that the issue is that European companies cannot establish themselves in Europe without establishing themselves in the US, and that this is economically inefficient and very harmful. Instead of lowering the bar for market entry, they raised it, making it now even more challenging to be a European provider here. This is a sadly familiar pattern of all information policies of the European Union and its member states, making things more expensive, making things more difficult, and not solving the real problems that actually exist. For instance, the European Union was really the originating point of several of the largest, most popular and cherished popular platforms that have ever existed on the internet. I speak, of course, of services like Oink, the Pirate Bay, and Demonoid. They had worldwide reach, and like no other services, connected people around the world on shared cultural experiences, large and small. It's no surprise that nationalism and fear feeds off of the lack of understanding one another, and pirate copying movies and music could have contributed to mitigating such ignorant resentment between peoples. Instead, the European Union banned these successful services, just like they have now raised market entry barriers for video streaming services, while continuously failing to make stronger efforts at facilitating the establishment of EU cultural services. A lot of people may not like it, but that's how it is. The European Union was really good at one thing, and then it banned that thing, because that's how Europe rolls. And then it aggressively complains about being a digital colony, maybe not in Denmark, but in France, let's say. Because complaining is apparently how to sort things out, while taking care of yourself isn't. So to finish off, I would like to stress that these issues that I have raised only allude to a larger framework of lack of European strategy and the increasing hostility from governments against ordinary people. Ultimately, the very broadest question is whether Europeans are enemies of Europe or friends of Europe. And I believe that Europeans, by and large, are friends of Europe, and that such a mindset should also dictate how policies in any area is developed. I believe it's in all of our interest that our interactions and communications are at the forefront of any political discussion. And with our, I mean us in the room, but also everyone in society at large. Because only through our interactions and friendships and joint efforts can we solve other outstanding issues, whether they be unequal distribution of income, the relative powerlessness of our governments in the face of investment capital, the climate crisis, or whatever other topic you want to solve. It is precisely because it is our cross-border friendship and mutual interactions that we must continuously raise and address the problems of our governments, religiously holding on to mass surveillance as a catch-all solution that all evidence points to being a different problem entirely, that we must continuously attempt to resist the image of citizens as the natural enemy of their governments and each other, and the fear of any European, or for that matter American, economic web-based activities so prevalent in our cultural establishments. So this is what I have worked for the past 13 years. What I look like I will be continuing to work for some time. And I hope that you are all willing to also join me in such work. And I want to thank you all for your kind attention tonight. Have a nice Bornhack 2019.
Do we have any questions for Emilia? Nobody? Oh, we have one here.
So about copyright length, academics, when they examine copyright, say a lower copyright length would be better economically. Was that considered during the recent EU copyright legislation? Why not?
Yes, why not? Because copyright is a very difficult field because there are so many entrenched interests that are extremely, it's also, Europe has difficulties making its own strategies, yeah? So in the copyright discussion, what you have is a fairly entrenched establishment in the US, which is very well rooted in the US political environment, and the US is very strategic. And then you have in the member states also these copyright entrenched interests, the member state level, which are also fairly strategic in their national territories. And so on both sides of the Atlantic, because there is such a large resistance to making any changes, it just wasn't even ever raised that you could lower the copyright times, because this is seen as far too out there. I mean, even small things like, does anyone in this room know what the Bern 3-step test is? Nobody? Has anybody heard of the Bern 3-step test? You're not supposed to, because it's like a weird feature of copyright international law that was created in whatever, the 1970s. And somebody proposed to make, it's like 3 steps that you test something in, basically. And somebody proposed a small tweak of the 3rd step of the test. And it was immediately attacked by, global copyright organizations as being revolutionary and harmful and, buccaneering and trying to kill people. So it's just like one of these political discussions where even making relatively theoretical and boring proposals, like, let's tweak the 3rd step of this test that nobody ever heard of, can create an alarmist and visceral opposition. And that makes politicians also very scared, yeah? I was encouraged by the discussion in this spring, because back when I started working for copyright, I was called a murderer and a leech and a butcher. I think I've been called maybe every bad name there is in the book. But this spring, at least there was sufficient opposition to this harmful narrative of cultural lockdown that they could only call me bot and zombie. So, it's over time this will resolve itself, perhaps, but we're still a long way off, and continued efforts are needed if we want to have cultural exchange now. Yeah.
Cool. We have another question.
Yeah, great talk. So, like, you spoke a lot about how the politicians are, to say the least, like they are not doing the right things. But how do we make them do the right things instead of doing the populist things or whatever the lobbyist tells them to do?
It's a difficult question. I think through the European Union there are some opportunities to work with, really good kind of moral leaders. So I know this from, like, when I was young, I was very skeptical of democratic traditions, and I didn't really see what was the point, and politicians were very distanced. And right now my Minister of Justice makes angry tweets. He's like a boring version of Donald Trump. It's extremely sad. So I was quite disenfranchised when I was younger. But when I came to the European Parliament, and I was there for 2 years, I realized that actually there's a lot of political leaders in Europe who who have a very strong moral fiber. And even though some of them are like Christian Democrats that I personally have not so many things in common with, I recognize that they are working towards the values that they cherish and that they believe in a way full of integrity and kind of honor, in a way. Europe is also not so, it's a bit isolated from some of these extreme conflicts at member state level between national security establishments and markets and so forth. There's less media attention, of course, in Europe. So I'm hoping that by having a stronger European framework, or by helping support the European frameworks like the GDPR, or even stuff like the Network and Information Security Directive, which I know, but I think it's generally small steps in the right direction. So by working to reinforce these good tendencies of Europe, maybe we can somehow eventually outmaneuver member states, the Westphalian state. But then you would just have to kind of, I know that right now Denmark has an extremely interesting MEP who is also, that I've interacted with in the past, Karen Melchior. So you might be able to, interact with her if you're from Denmark. Most of the member states have at least one MEP who's not at all weird. And so reach out to them and see, or try to work out if there's an opportunity to engage on this level, or engage directly with regulatory bodies that implement European laws, which in Denmark would be the Erhvervs. I can't pronounce it at all, but the Erhvervs, the people that do telecoms, and maybe the Datatilsynet, and try to boost their confidence in acting on these European ideals. So, stuff like this.
A small note on that. Karen is actually going to be here on Monday hosting a keynote. It's not announced yet, but she will be around. We have another question.
Yes, I see a lot of good laws in the EU, and one of them I really like is the one with roaming. So when you arrive in a European country, there is now free roaming for. Does something special happen when we get the good laws? Because there must, of course, also be resistance to these laws, but they still get voted through. Or how does that happen? Because I found your talk slightly negative.
So roaming was originally introduced like in 2008 or so, and it was because the then commissioner had failed to impose. So the reason why in Sweden there's such good internet connectivity is because functional separation was imposed on our big operators. And this didn't happen in France or in Germany or in Spain, and that's why generally in those countries you have a lot of entrenched interests, still vertically integrated monoliths that sit on copper networks and do rent seeking. So the then commissioner made a proposal to get rid of that situation in the big member states, Germany, France, Spain, in 2006, but failed. Because the vertically integrated operators were not at all happy of losing economic interest. And then roaming was launched as a kind of audience, like a publicity thing, which the operators didn't really mind. And that could also be simply passed in 1 year. Actually making price regulation on markets is very difficult. And in the European Union, a particular challenge of the roaming legislation that continues to exist today is that your operator, when you go abroad, is not allowed to charge you, but the operators are allowed to charge each other. So this is actually not very good for mobile operators who don't own their own core networks, which means that in order to have effective competition, you need to build many different parallel networks in the country. So you don't just have one infrastructure for Denmark, but maybe 3 or 4 parallel ones, and that's more expensive and less efficient from a coverage perspective. So personally, I could have been happy if they solved the roaming issue in some other way, kind of more similar to open peering that we've seen in wired networks. And I know if some of you might work on mobile network standards or technologies, and you will say, well, open peering doesn't work because the technology is very different. But I think that moving somehow in that direction would have been a more productive use of the European Union's resources and the expertise that we have in the member states and having price regulation. Now we're stuck with roaming, and all the politicians like it because all the voters like it, and it's not, for me, it was never optimal. But I'm not running for elections, so I don't have to say that things that you like, I also like.
Do we have any more questions? I see none. Let's give a big round of applause for Amelia.